Six-time book author Stacy Schiff made a guest appearance in early April at Purdue University. She was a guest of the C-SPAN Center for Scholarship and Engagement, which is run by Andrea Langrish and the faculty and students of Purdue. A large number of questions were asked by the students studying communications and political science. Stacy Schiff's latest book, The Revolutionary Samuel Adams, was published in 2022. Her 2005 book on Benjamin Franklin has been used as a primary source for an Apple TV series currently available on that streaming service. Students also ask her about her writing and her other books, from Cleopatra to The Witches, Salem, 1692. Good evening, everybody. We're very happy to have Stacy Schiff with us, and we have students that are prepared to ask questions very soon, as you all know, those of you who have been coming to these things. So let's start by getting the basics from Stacy. What was it like growing up in Adams, Massachusetts?
I think it's a tricky thing to ask a biographer about her own life. Thank you all for coming out. Brian, I would fly across the world to have a conversation with you. Thank you for only making me come to Indiana, which I hope to come to again to ask you these questions next year on this stage. There was in Adams, Massachusetts, population 13,000, no movie theater, no bowling alley, no restaurant open after about 3 p.m., but there was a public library. And so that was pretty much my refuge. And I suspect that if there had been other attractions, I might not have ended up in the public library, but I did. And from it, I was summarily ejected when I was about 13 for having crept up to the adult reading room. And this was the greatest humiliation of my life, because I was sort of dragged out by the ear, and my parents got a protesting phone call. And I think that may have turned me into a reader for life. Because whatever that woman was guarding up there, I wanted it.
What were your parents like?
My mother was an academic and very much given to literature. And my father ran a clothing business in town and had an eye disorder which actually prevented him from reading, which is always interesting when I think about it now.
How much of your success have they been able to watch?
Relatively little, sadly.
How long have they been gone?
My mother's around. My father's been gone. My father died within a month of the publication of my first book, so just barely missed it. Yeah.
What was it like when that first book came off the presses?
You know, books are, I guess they're like babies in the sense that they seem like they're mythical creatures. For the longest time, you say you're going to write a book, and you talk about writing a book, and sometimes you actually even sit down and begin writing a book. But it's always still just sort of a pipe dream. And then one day, and then you hand a manuscript to a publisher, and it's still a pipe dream, and then you go back and forth with the editor, and you're complaining about every sentence, and it remains a pipe dream, and then one day this thing arrives on your doorstep. And I don't think it ever feels less miraculous than it did the first time, that holding the thing in your hands that you had pretty much been in denial about for 4 or 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
Can you remember the biggest high you've had during the process of writing all these books?
Yeah, coming to Purdue to talk to you. I mean, there's always a moment. I think the thing every scholar, every historian, every biographer lives for is that moment when either in an interview or sitting in an archive, you stumble across something that no one else has ever seen, and is going to either change the way you view your subject, or that you think your reader might view your subject, but in any case is going to create a scene for you or an angle for you that is utterly original. And I'll just give you one example. I did a book many years ago about Ben Franklin's years in France. And during those years, between 1778 and 1783, Franklin goes to Versailles every Wednesday to pay court to Louis XVI. And one day, several years into the research, it occurred to me that if Franklin made that trip every week to Versailles, then every other member of the ambassadorial corps at Versailles was probably writing dispatches home to Venice and Denmark and Spain and all of the parts of Italy and Germany about Benjamin Franklin, because it was this crazy notion that this new republic had been formed. And so sure enough, in the archives of all those other countries were these firsthand accounts of conversations overheard at Versailles between Franklin and the other diplomats, or Franklin and the king. And that was just material that I knew no one had unearthed before, and that gives us a really different Franklin.
So your last book was on Samuel Adams. Don't call me Sam.
Only if you want to order a beer.
So of all the characters you've written about, from Cleopatra to Franklin to Samuel Adams, Saint Exupery, which one would you rather spend time with?
That's like, which one of your children is your favorite?
I'm going to get to your children.
Yeah. So that might be an easier question to answer. I don't. The one who just said to me, "Are you in a tornado?" That's the favorite. I can't really answer that question. I think my feeling about the subject is inextricably bound up with my feeling about the difficulty of researching or living with the subject. And for example, Cleopatra, very hard to get an intimate take on Cleopatra, not only because she lived in the 1st century BC, but because she's a politician, and you can't get as close to a politician as you can get to, say, a writer. I don't have intimate letters, obviously, from Cleopatra as I had from the Nabokovs. But I will admit that I'm, for the first time ever, going back to a subject, which would imply that I had thought he was good company, and that's Benjamin Franklin. And part of that, I think, is that Franklin is just effortlessly, infinitely interesting, and has so many angles that he's practically round. I mean, you can approach him from every possible direction. For everything he says, you can think of a contrary statement. I mean, this is a man who founds a fire company and a fire insurance company. He's just endlessly, to me, intriguing, and he's very good company. So I'm not sure he's the favorite of the subjects, but it's a fabulously rich archive, and it's one I just feel I haven't quite finished with. I feel like I haven't finished with Franklin yet.
I heard you say in one of the interviews, I don't know, may have been one that we did together, that your children don't read your books, but they read. Is it still true that they don't read your books?
I think I forced them to watch that interview to shame them. My eldest is a reader of nonfiction and has, I think, now read all or nearly all of my books. I have never asked the other two, who are both big readers of fiction. My youngest child is an aspiring writer, and so in a funny way, I hope she hasn't, do you know what I mean? I just feel like I want to stay out of her lane. So in a way, I hope she hasn't read my stuff. Every once in a while, she'll send me an article that I don't even remember writing and say, this is kind of clever or something. So she's clearly Googling me every once in a while. I mean, I wrote a piece many, many years ago about absent mothers and how necessary it is for a mother to be absent for us to have children's literature. Because if you can't name a mother in children's literature, they're always out of the room. That's why the Cat in the Hat can arrive. And I don't even remember writing this piece, which was clearly an attempt on my part to come to terms with my guilt about being an absent mother, but this little detective of mine discovered it recently.
How old are your three children?
The little detective is 23, and the other two are 30 and 32.
What was it like writing these books, having to spend so much time in the research area, having to raise three children?
The trauma has probably not yet lifted from their lives. I do remember a family vacation which I spent. The Nabokov book, which was my second book, came in very long, which, I mean, it's always easier to write a long book than a short book, and I think I was instructed to cut 150 pages or something. And I remember taking it to a family vacation where they spent the day at the beach and I spent the day in the coffee shop of the hotel, slashing pages out of the manuscript. And I like to think they had a better vacation because their mother was absent, but that may not have entirely been the case.
Because
they didn't know any other kind of childhood, so it's,
Because we are going to have the student questions very soon, I want to ask, if you're my age, you're still reading hard copy newspapers. If you're your age, I don't know how you do that. Do you still buy the New York Times in hard copy?
I might be the last living subscriber to the paper New York Times, but I can do you one better. I, a few years ago, for the Samuel Adams book, read the hard copies of the Boston Gazette and the Boston Evening Post from basically through the 1760s and 1770s in paper copy.
At the library?
At the Massachusetts Historical Society, yes. And then I needed to get my eyes examined. Yeah.
But then your kids are in the 20s, 30s area. Have you noticed a change in what they read and how they read? Because everybody now in public life is talking about AI. And can you see the impact on this period of your kids, how they changed?
I see them getting, I mean, obviously we're all in different news silos now, and I think they are of two different generations, as many of you know. The youngest is the Snapchat generation. My older kids were very much, I mean, none of them was really an Instagram person, but yes, their news sources have changed. I still think they're reading traditional media, but on a screen. And you know, we are of different political convictions, some of us, so different pieces of traditional media on the screen. But yeah, I was in a taxi the other day with my newspaper, and the cab driver turned around and said, "Haven't seen one of those in a while."
There's only one place you can buy a newspaper, I think, in this town now, other than the Journal and Courier, is at Bonds, one of my
Thank you for that tip.
Yeah, well, he's terrific. He's been doing this since 1968.
I feel like if it hasn't come off on your fingers, you haven't properly read the news, you know?
Students, who's going to start this questions? Because they've been studying your work. And where's Joshua? Is he here? Joshua, where are you? Come down here. Come down here. He has watched so much of you. And Sam, I want you to come out here too. So getting ready for tonight and all those clips, tell the folks here what you've been doing to get ready for Stacy's visit.
All right, so good evening, everyone. My name's Joshua. I'm an accounting and public relations double major here at Purdue University. And for the last couple of days, we have been looking at all of Stacy's interviews throughout the past 30-ish years of your career.
120 years.
Well, I wouldn't go that
saw
far.
those images. That was 100 years ago. Yeah.
So we sifted through all of that material for around 2 days, and then Sam over here can tell you more about the video editing process, but it was incredible what he managed to do.
I've never really heard many people call my work incredible. No, but yeah, it's I mainly give credit to Stacy for having so many good clips to choose from. It was genuinely difficult to pick sort of the best ones out of all of the interviews and book tours that you've given that have been on C-SPAN. So basically the whole process with editing it wasn't very difficult because of that.
Sam, what did you learn about Stacy?
I learned a lot. Pretty much every book that she had written up until that point, I did a separate interview with her today for a project that I'm working on, in which I got to talk more about that, sort of like more in-depth questions than the ones that she's hopefully been asked before.
Joshua, what did you come away with, your image of Stacy before you met her?
Oh, first of all, I added all of her books to my shopping cart.
Bless you. Bless you. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the questions that I was thinking about asking you back there is, I'm an aspiring writer. At some point, I want to live that pipe dream of making a book come into existence. What advice do you have for me or any other aspiring author here in this room?
First of all, thank you both for that. I mean, that was a little mind-boggling, and my children will now never have to do it because you did it, so thank you. I would not wish that assignment on anyone. I think I'm going to give you the same advice every other writer you've ever talked to would give you, which is to read and then to reread and then to reread some more. And not necessarily things that are only excellent, but things that are either execrably bad or things that are very, very good. And try to stay out of the middle. Because the middle is the sort of complacent middle and you don't want to land there. But the beauty of reading things that either are failures or badly written or poorly put together is it's like seeing a bad movie. You realize what it could have been, and you begin to think out the problems and how these problems occurred and what you would do to resolve those problems. And that's as constructive, it seems to me, as is being blinded by the beauty of a perfect book, right? So I think it's almost a more instructive part of the spectrum. But, I mean, honestly, there's no apprenticeship, strangely, for writing except for the reading. And I do think you oxygenate your brain and it somehow, in some magical way, I'm sorry to make it sound so mystical, just kind of lands on the page.
I want to go back to Sam and I'll let you guys go and get some other questions. But Sam, you know something that I don't know, and I'm fascinated to find out from you. You said you asked Stacy today about her next book. What did you learn?
I did learn that Stacy's next book is, again, going to be focusing on Franklin, not from his years, as your first book focused on his years as he was being in France, but I believe you said it was his years immediately after, was it?
That's right.
Thank you, gentlemen, and let me ask you, Stacy, to follow up on that. Where are you in the process, and how are you going about doing this next book on Franklin, the same subject?
I'm early enough in the process that I'm not going to take up too much time answering your question because I haven't figured out how to do it yet. One of the things I need to do, speaking of hard copies of newspapers, is to read the Philadelphia papers. This is a book about Franklin in 1785 sails back from France. He's unsure if he should come back. He's been gone for 8 years. He's unsure of the reception he'll get in Philadelphia. He's in terrible health, and he doesn't know if his acclaim in America will meet his acclaim in France. He gets on the ship to come back, and he immediately feels better than he's felt in 30 years. And he arrives to this tremendous ovation in Philadelphia, and then has this kind of rousing last 5 years to his life. So the book is sort of about what would you do with 5 years if you didn't expect to have those extra 5 years, and how does Franklin deal with the Constitutional Convention and the questions of slavery and the other questions of basically diminishing returns in these years. And I want to weave the rest of the life through it. So what I have been slowly and slavishly doing is reading consecutively through the papers of Benjamin Franklin, which is a delicious assignment, if a slightly arduous one. But from there, I'm not quite sure where I'm going. There is this Franklin series coming out, which we can talk about, and that has kind of slowed me down a little bit.
Why don't we, before we go to the next student question, tell us about the series.
So the previous book on Franklin, which is called A Great Improvisation, about the 8.5 years Franklin spends in France, has been turned into an Apple TV series, which will begin airing next Friday, April 12th, starring Michael Douglas as Ben Franklin.
Not bad.
Not bad. Surprisingly convincing.
Students, give us your name and what school you're in and what year you are. Will?
Hi, Brian. Hi, Ms. Schiff. Thank you so much for coming to Purdue and welcome to West Lafayette. My name is Will Courtney. I am a junior studying media, mass communications, and political science. Today, I want to ask you about finding a story. You've written a lot of books about the Salem witch trials, about Benjamin Franklin, all sorts of different stuff. So how do you find what's an interesting topic versus something that you could write a whole novel about?
It's a great question, because what is interesting at first glance is not always interesting by the time you sit down to write. You probably know this brilliant piece of writerly advice that was offered by Elmore Leonard, which is when someone asked how he writes such a compelling book, he says, "I leave out the parts the reader tends to skip." So there's a little bit of that. I mean, for example, in the Samuel Adams book, it is necessary at one juncture to talk about 18th century Massachusetts economic policy. I tried to make that as short and sweet as possible because I didn't really think the reader wanted to stall there. But I do feel that openings are crucially important, and that keeping your subject kind of looking over your shoulder, or at least present on the page at all times, especially with biography, is crucially important. And so, for example, with the Salem witchcraft, but with the book about Salem witchcraft called The Witches, I didn't have a single sensibility with which I was following through time, but I had to write about something, I had to write about a delusion. So you have to figure out how you're going to convince your reader to buy into something that everyone else in this book subscribes to, but we today no longer believe in. And so the book opens with someone having sworn under oath to a group of justices that she had flown to a satanic meeting and crashed on her pole en route, from which she could still feel the pain in her leg. And I figured if that didn't fly you into the story, then I was out of ideas. So I mean, some of it is just figuring out an unusual opening or an unusual angle. And a lot of it, I think, is just keeping the subject's voice, especially with the Adams book, keeping his voice on the page. He writes anthem after anthem to American liberties. I found them to be tremendously moving, and I thought the more I could include his voice and him in a picture which had really been written without him, the more I was going to keep the reader sitting on the edge of his seat. I mean, the job really is make the reader turn the page. That's your only job. And I think to do that, you want to not stall on Massachusetts economic history, and you want to make the reader think, in this book, for example, where exactly was Paul Revere going in mid-April 1774 when he sets out from Boston, and he's going to warn Samuel Adams of arrest. The fact that we don't have that second half of the picture, I thought, was an argument for the book. And so that's where it begins.
Jack.
Good evening. Thank you not only to Brian for coming here tonight to Purdue, we greatly appreciate, but also Ms. Schiff, who is not only, again, attending in person, but also in the hot seat from Brian and answering these questions. My question for you tonight is more on, how maybe your research and literature and your writings has impacted your perspective throughout the years. I know in my own, at least, education, or at least some of the research and work I've done for different projects or different assignments, I find myself kind of employing some of the ideas that the people I've written about or read about in my own life. And I was wondering if that's also happened with you, and if some of these stories and ideologies have stayed with you beyond, the publication of a book or a piece of literature.
I think when I finish a book, I have, to a great extent, finished with the ideas in the book, and don't diverge from those thenceforth. It's somehow, it's kind of compacted in my mind, and it's not going to budge. But in the years that I'm working, I find it essential to not have any preconceptions. And that's a difficult and uncomfortable place to live, right? I mean, uncertainty is not anything that makes any of us happy, I think. But I think it's very important to have very strong curiosity and very weak affiliations, as a New Yorker writer once put it, and to live in a state of suspense and let the material tell you what it's going to tell you. Because if you're not listening to what you're reading, you're not really doing your job properly. And the beauty of that is that your ideas change in the course of researching something. You can feel your ideas evolving. And I find that even when I sit down to start to write, my ideas continue to evolve. So the ideology, whatever philosophical treatises you may have read on the subject should be part of the background, but I feel as if they should be knit into a narrative that is really composed of the research materials themselves. And that can be very difficult. Sometimes there's a body of literature that you've somehow inhaled and that you can't get out of your lungs. And I just feel like it's very important to somehow do that and to be able to see something with fresh eyes.
Over here.
Hi, I'm Jaden Berkeley, and I'm a junior studying political science. And my question was more about how you came to find interest in this genre, and was there anything specific that inspired you to know that these are the type of stories that you want to tell?
I loved reading biography, even as a child. And part of that, I think I probably am repeating something that woman on the screen said, part of that is that I like reading history through someone else's eyes, through the sensibility of someone else. And it's just a more intimate approach to history. So I devoured these little red, white, and blue, series of biographies that I think I forced on my children as well. But as a fledgling writer, biography had an additional allure, which is that it has a beginning and a middle and an end. You kill your subject in the end, no matter what. So starting out, I thought, well, this, there's a certain formulaic quality to it with which I have subsequently played, but which, as a fledgling writer, I found to be, rather comfortable. So, and I had this idea for the first book that I kept thinking someone else should write. I was an editor in a publishing house at the time, and I kept thinking someone else should write it. And finally, I realized I wasn't giving the idea away because I actually wanted to do it. And a lot of that was falling in love with a certain moment in French history, which I found to be utterly enthralling and which I have since tried. I've tried many times to go back to and never succeeded. But I think a lot of that was the appeal of living a sort of double life. You're always watching the world, through your eyes and then through Benjamin Franklin's. You go to the movies and Cleopatra sitting next to you. I mean, there's just something very rich to me about that double-barreled vision. And I think that's the thing that's kept me. I once have diverted from biography with the witchcraft book, but I kind of keep coming back here.
Is your full name Pulitzer Prize winning Stacy Schiff? Have you noticed that every time people use that, and what's that like?
When I get to a restaurant, no one has ever greeted me that way. It's such a shame. No, I remember thinking, when I won the Pulitzer after I had sold the Franklin book, I guess. And I remember suddenly realizing when the jacket design first came my way, oh, they're going to put this on all the books now. I get that. So no, it's definitely not my given name.
It's right here on the Samuel Adams book, right at the bottom. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Mackenzie, and I'm a sophomore studying political science and economics. I'm wondering, as a critically acclaimed biographer, how you maintain the balance between historical accuracy with also being engaging to modern day readers.
So that's a great question. And I would recycle Elmore Leonard's great advice there, right? But I think that to a large extent, if you're willing to take someone carefully back to a rich story, you don't have to be very presentist, for lack of a better word, about it. You really can, and the Witchcraft book is a good example. I was probably 20 pages into that book when I realized that you have to explain to a modern reader what these people in 17th century New England meant by witchcraft. So then that meant a sort of 10-page, very quick, universal history of witchcraft and what someone meant, which was not Margaret Hamilton and the Wizard of Oz or something out of Harry Potter. It was a biblical construct, and it was an accomplice of the devil who, acting through various imps, could work magic, but could generally steal your soul. The whole point here was the struggle over the human soul. And so I felt like that's a very, very alien concept to most of us, without which, of course, you can't begin to understand what happened in Salem. But it's also so sort of fundamentally fascinating that if I told that the right way, and if I included a sense of where the rest of the world was on the question of witchcraft at the time in 1692, where the skeptical literature had begun to grow up and where it had failed to penetrate, which is to say New England, the reader would follow me. So I guess a lot of that I like to think, on a good day, I think narrative craft takes care of that. I like to think that, even when you're telling the story of Cleopatra, I'm not telling a feminist version of Cleopatra, but I have subsequently been told that that book is being taught at Yale as a feminist tract. So don't take my advice here.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Spencer Hartman. I'm a senior majoring in political science and psychology. I was wondering what methods or tools you use to get to know your subjects on a more personal level.
So I don't think I'm telling tales out of school if I tell you that another biographer, whose name I won't mention publicly, would always wear the perfume of her subject. And I have actually been in the position of interviewing a woman who told me that a previous biographer, a woman who had an affair with one of my subjects, had been basically seduced by a previous biographer, male, who wanted to be close to the woman who was close to his subject. So, people go to some lengths, is what I'm trying to say. I haven't done either of those things. There's a famous case of a British biographer who felt the need, I think it was Malcolm Lowry's biographer, he felt the need to contract all the diseases that Malcolm Lowry had contracted. So what I'm telling you is biographers are nuts, is in short, right? A lot of it is reading the novels that they have read. Because of Ben Franklin, I read Robinson Crusoe last week. I mean, a lot of it is just marinating in the world in which they lived. For the witchcraft book, I read every Puritan sermon that anyone in Eastern Massachusetts could possibly have heard over those 9 months. Knowing what diaries exist at the time, seeing the movies, the novels that your subjects saw. I knew a lot about what Vera and Vladimir Nabokov had watched on TV, which was pretty hilarious. So a lot of it's just basically acquainting yourself with the world in which your subject lived so that you could put the person in context. And very often you find unexpected riches. I mean, some of those Puritan sermons, interestingly, turned up in some of the witchcraft testimony in court, which I don't think anyone had ever noticed before, but it's like lint. It was like little bits and pieces of this imagery was recycled in the court testimony. So a lot of it is just inhabiting the same world as your subject, which I think is part of the appeal for me of Ben Franklin, because this is really sort of Enlightenment America, and it's kind of a thrilling address.
If I'm right, I read that you were married in 1989.
What does that have to do with anything I'm saying?
I want you to tell us about your husband. And he's had to live like your children with your wife.
I think he thinks that he lives in a sort of, marriage of 3 people most of the time. And I think there have been certain subjects. I think he was very happy when I said that Franklin was coming back to live with us. I think he found Cleopatra really difficult. Cleopatra, I should say, was my husband's idea. I had been writing a series of op-ed pieces for the Times on women in politics, and I kept tripping over the question of women in power. Why was that such a toxic combination? Why did it always seem to sort of detour the narrative? And at dinner one night, my husband said something about Cleopatra, and wouldn't that make a great subject for a biography? And I just scoffed, because I'm a generally mean and negative person, and said, how could you possibly write that book? There's absolutely no documentation. And then I wrote the book on Franklin, for which there was an impossible amount of documentation, most of it in France and in French. And I thought, a book with no documentation, that sounds really appealing. But by then I had kind of figured out I'm teasing, I had figured out how I thought I could possibly write my way toward Cleopatra. So that book was his idea, but she's a pretty ruthless, strategic thinker, and I think by the end of that, he was ready to say goodbye to her. Anyway, the answer to your question is hugely supportive, and obviously, came up with a pretty good idea there.
But not in the business that you're in at all.
Not at all, not at all. No sane writer would marry another writer.
But go back to the books that you've already written. It was very interesting when you said he gave you the idea. Were there other books that somebody gave you the idea of?
No. And every once in a while, when you write a book, people immediately come to you with similar ideas. So after Cleopatra, I think every person in America emailed me about another Hellenistic or ancient sovereign, female. And I just didn't want, my problem, as you may have noticed, is I don't like to write the same book twice. So, except for Franklin. So I didn't, those ideas weren't all that appealing. Every once in a while, every 6 or 7 years, there is the what's the next subject. And my husband will very often come up with some, crackpot idea, which I smile, encouragingly about and then forget immediately. No, I'm only kidding.
Matt?
Hi, Brian. Hi, Stacey. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Matt Stalker. I'm from Fort Wayne. I'm a senior in political science and political communication. My question is, what do you believe is the most important thing people should know about Samuel Adams and his contribution to the American Revolution?
Wow, what a great question. I think I would say that Adams single-handedly comes up with the vocabulary and the grammar for a conflict, which was obviously going to happen anyway, and for which the colonies are, toward which the colonies are slowly building anyway, but where everyone is very much off of the same page. And it is Adams who comes up with a sort of universal language and manages to connect the colonies so that everyone is suddenly speaking in unison and in the same voice, and oddly enough, often in the same imagery. And that is something he'd been trying to do for probably a decade, and with which he finally succeeds with the Boston Tea Party, which is arguably his masterpiece. But the fact that you don't see his fingerprints unless you look for them, you only see his fingerprints from the other side. You see his fingerprints if you read the archives in London, which are essentially the letters that the royal governors and the lieutenant governors and the customs officials were writing home, in which they complain of Samuel Adams and all of his misdeeds, because he never claims credit for these things. So I would say that is the single accomplishment, but it's almost invisible unless you turn the paper upside down.
Thank you.
James?
Good evening, Ms. Schiff. Thank you for being here. My name is James. I'm a senior from Munster, Indiana, studying political science and political communication. My question has to do with your most recent book about Sam Adams. As you're talking about slicing 150 pages from the manuscript of your second book, it made me wonder, what sort of things would you like to tell us that didn't make it into your most recent book? Just any sort of fun facts or anecdotes about the life of Sam Adams.
So I had a fight with my publisher on this book because I wanted it to be a shorter book. I wanted it to be the length of Cleopatra, which is about 300-ish pages, I think. And the publisher's feeling was the reader of American history likes a big, fat Bob Carroll, Ron Chernow, David McCullough book. And I kept saying, no. So the answer, there's relatively little on the cutting room floor because I was doing my very best to slim down a book that the publisher was trying to, either with margins or with a typeface to inflate in some way. There are many questions, however, I would like to ask Samuel Adams, which I cannot answer. And one of those would indeed be, who was he indeed, with whom did he work to mastermind the Boston Tea Party? I mean, we know he is one of the prime movers that evening. We know that the thing is strategically and very carefully choreographed. But what went into that planning, and how did they manage the extraordinary secrecy that they managed? So, I have a lot of questions for him, but alas, they are not ones for which any documents are going to provide any ready answers.
Thank you.
For some of the folks in the audience, they'll remember, still to this day, it's a very active name in this state, that you write about in your book. At the Boston Massacre, someone was killed by the name of Crispus Attucks. Who was he?
He's actually the first victim, if you want to look at it this way, of the revolution. He's the first African-American victim. There are 96, I think, depositions taken in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre. Almost none of them agree about anything. But if you look at those depositions and you look at the court testimony, John Adams is the one who's defending the soldiers at the court trial that fall, you see a lot about Crispus Attucks, and he does not entirely come off as the martyred victim whom Samuel Adams tries to paint him as. He comes off as someone who was actually very pugnacious and was doing his best to provoke some kind of confrontation with the British soldiers.
There is a high school, and it's been had different middle school types in Indianapolis called the Crispus Attucks High School. Somebody in this audience will remember that, somebody my age. Right, Brother Poole? Next question. We'll come over here after you. Right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Keely. I'm a senior in political science with a concentration actually in international relations. And that sort of concentration drives a lot of my research, looking at historical figures, because I do have a minor in history, and looking how they've influenced, nations and interactions between nations. Do you ever in your research, into these American figures sort of take an examination of how they're interacting maybe with prominent international figures at the time, how they're influencing relations, and then do you have an interest in writing about any of those like other international like figures of that same time period?
There's a great deal of that. It comes up in numerous places. There's a great deal of it in the first book because Saint-Exupéry, who's a French flyer, spends essentially the early part of World War II in New York City, where he writes The Little Prince, in fact, during those years, and is desperate to get back to the front, but he needs permission to get back to the front. So there's an enormous correspondence. The U.S. Intelligence forces at that point are keeping track of every foreigner in New York because they can't figure out anybody's politics, and they're making a botch of it, in fact, and they're trying to figure out where he stands. So there's a great deal of going back and forth with him begging permission from various US authorities. No one really understands who's leading the French in these years. So there's a great deal of sort of international intrigue about how he makes his way finally back to North Africa, ultimately to Corsica, and into the cockpit of an American airplane, which he could not fly. And that is essentially, he flies 8 reconnaissance missions, and then he disappears on the last. So there's an enormous amount of sort of international correspondence about that. It comes up particularly, obviously, in the Franklin book, because you have this entire international cast assembled at the court of Versailles. At that moment, France is in its glory. It's fighting a war against Great Britain, its traditional rival, and everyone at court is watching very closely the conduct of these upstart Americans. And as I mentioned, all those other archives, that was a nightmare to research because these were all day-to-day accounting. The ambassadors, by definition, are writing to their home courts weekly. That was their assignment. They're writing about every single detail they observe. They're in languages I don't read, and often in archives which were very difficult to access. So that put me off of doing international research for quite some time. But I will say that there are riches there which are untapped, and so that is also very encouraging to me. There's one subject I have always wanted to do, but I don't speak and no, I'm not going to mention who it is, but I don't speak the language. And so it has been sort of, a great disappointment to me that I don't have the language I would need for that subject.
You have a bunch of successful writers right here in this audience that have done books, and I want to ask you your technique. What time of day do you write?
So I used to be a late night person, and now I'm the minute I can possibly get into my office in the morning, which is usually about 6:30 person until the caffeine gives out, which is usually about 1 o'clock. And I think any writer who says she actually writes longer than that, maybe someone feels differently, is probably lying. But I think I can edit after that. I can do email anytime and obsessively. But I think the actual tangle with the page, and I, as you know, I still write with a pencil on a piece of legal paper, is really kind of a 4-hour, 5-hour at the most, for me anyway, journey.
Richard Norton Smith writes with a pencil and a yellow pad and then sends it out to a woman in Kansas he's a terrible writer, he'll admit it, and she translates it into copy. What do you do with...
Can you get me her name?
Yeah.
I don't think, I have this problem, which is I'm not sure anyone else could read my handwriting. I don't know what his reasoning is. Mine is that it slows me down to have to actually drag the pencil across the page. Oddly enough, means you actually have to stop for your thoughts. I'm very fast. I'm a very fast typist, thanks to my 7th grade typing teacher, and I don't think as fast as I type. And I find that also that when I type something, it's much longer. I feel there's a concision to the writing because the writing is actually quite arduous. So you're actually slowing down and you're, I think, writing more pointedly. But then I'm the one who types it into the computer. But I think I would not want to farm that out to anyone in Kansas, not because I dislike Kansas, but because that's really the first editorial. I'm editing as I'm putting it into the computer on that first round. And things change and often get clarified considerably between that first draft and the first sort of computer draft.
Question.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Vaughn. I'm a senior history major. This is kind of a two-parter question. Oftentimes when I'm writing, I experience like mad writing block. And my first question is, what was the easiest and hardest book that you've written? And then the second question is, when you are experiencing writer's block, what are some of the tools that you use to get out of it?
Can I take the second part first?
Yeah.
Because I'm blocked on the first. Caffeine. I'm sorry. Chocolate, caffeine, chocolate. It's pretty much like a constant cocktail. Exercise is the real answer to your question. I mean, there's almost, the next morning is always just like a revelation. It's kind of like, why did that seem so difficult yesterday? And I'm a huge believer in letting something sit and marinate and walking away from it. Because not only does the problem tend to resolve itself somehow, because you're thinking subliminally about it when you're not at your desk and not staring at the problem straight in the face, but there's just something about the temporal distance that gives you the perspective on the work. And I feel that about everything. I mean, if I could write a book and then wait a year and read it over before I sent it to the publisher, I would, because I do think you see things in that time that you're just too close to it to see in the moment. What was the other part of the question?
What was the easiest book?
Easiest. None of them was easy. No, I'd be lying if I said any was easy. The only thing that's easy to write is the dedication page. I like those. Those are good. But you only get to write one like every 5 or 6 years. I mean, I just think it should always be hard because it's one of these activities where you can always do it slightly better, even if that just means that you're replacing a comma with a semicolon. And in that little bit of infinite distance, there's always a bit of frustration, right? You're always thinking this could be slightly, I could tweak this slightly, I could make this a little sharper. And especially at, term paper length or book length, it's very hard to have the time to do that.
Your friend Bob Caro always had the same editor for every word he ever wrote, Bob Gottlieb. He died within the last year. Do you have the same editor every time you write?
I have been been married once, but I've been very promiscuous in my editors. So I had a different editor for the first, the second, and the third book, which were 3 different houses, Connaught, Random House, and then Holt. Then I had the same editor, blessedly, for Cleopatra, The Witches, and this book. And unfortunately, he's just left the firm, and I've just left the publisher as well. So I have a new editor for the new book.
Well, Bob Caro and his editor, and he said this publicly, so I'm not giving away any secrets, did not like each other. And so you can imagine the history of that relationship.
Yeah. I will say that the editor, Michael Peach, who was the editor for this book and Cleopatra and the Witches, was an extraordinary editor, except that his handwriting is arguably worse than mine. So often I had to call him and say, "What does this say?" But too light an editor for my taste. I would have liked for someone to have been more of a Bob Gottlieb with my prose.
Hi, my name is Mara. I am a sophomore, and I'm a triple major in political science, law and society, and communications. And my question is, so one of my main interests is looking at the past history and how to apply it to present and future day, and per se is learning from our past mistakes. So with your deep understanding of history and historical figures, how can insight from past figures you have studied inform solutions impacting present day problems?
Well, the really excellent news is there is really not very much new under the sun, right? So there is an enormous amount always that carries forward. Something that continually shocks me when you go back to read, I guess Cleopatra is the best instance of this, is how much people assumed that the previous story was the present story, and how much you took, what just happened, how much you borrowed from history and assumed that was what you were seeing in front of you, even when it wasn't. And that's, I think, a lesson we should all probably attend to. And I mentioned it with Cleopatra for the following reason. Cleopatra's story comes down, she's a Greek woman whose story comes down to us largely through Roman men, none of whom had very few of whom had any fondness for her, all but Plutarch anyway. And in their stories about her, they very often take toxic stories of other Hellenistic sovereigns or of other very wealthy Easterners, all of whom they found suspect, and they apply those stories to Cleopatra. So for example, the story of Cleopatra dissolving the pearl in vinegar was a story that had been told about other queens. It was not new to her. But you just kind of applied, let's tell that old tale about her, and we can paint her with the same brush. And I think that we tend to do that same thing, where we tend to assume we understand what we're seeing. Human nature, though, is remarkably consistent as well. And I think that for me is one of the beauties of looking at some of these tales. It's just shockingly consistent. I've just done a piece about America's founding and France's role versus where we are today with Ukraine. You have a fledgling republic appealing to a wealthy power. It's a very parallel situation, and the differences that brings out in in the current climate.
Where did you write that piece? Who did you write it for?
If I get back to edit it, it'll be in the Times on Sunday.
And what's that like when you?
Stressful.
Why?
I'm only kidding.
How many words?
It's probably about 1,300 words.
And what's it like to write a column? I mean,
there's an adrenaline to writing a column. The problem with writing a book is I spend 3 or 4 years researching, and I spend a year or 2 writing, and then it takes 9 months to publish a book, and then by the time it comes out, you've practically forgotten what you wrote about. Whereas there's something, extremely gratifying about, I've got an idea, and you head to your desk and you spend a few days writing it, and in an ideal world, you sell it, and then it's out. The other beauty is you don't get reviewed.
She's still mad at me for an interview I did with her, and I suggested.
Let's just not talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
She got one in her whole life bad review. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening to both. Thank you for your time. Sorry, I'm on the shorter side. We're moving the microphone. Thank you. My name is Skylar Moffel. I'm a freshman from New York studying media and mass communication, as well as psychological sciences. My question for you is, considering that you've written about different kinds of historical figures in your books, do you follow a specific methodology when writing these, or does it change based on who you're writing about?
I think that methodology is something I've sort of run from as fast as possible, in the sense that I only know afterward how I should have researched the book. And very often I do things neither methodically nor according to any sheer methodology. I mean, a smart person, if writing about someone who was, as the case of my first and third subjects, fairly recently dead, would be to make a list immediately of the people who still survived and interview them according to, from ascending age to descending age. And I've never managed somehow to be able to do that in any kind of methodical fashion. On the other hand, when I just mentioned earlier, needing to know the entire ecosystem in which the subject lived, I think that has been, that's been sort of a basic tenet, that you need to know the territory completely. You need to know what it smelled like and what it tasted like. And part of reading all of those 18th century Boston newspapers is that I can tell you what Boston sounded like, what it smelled like, what people's preoccupations were. And so that's, is that methodology to get to know the territory? I don't know, and it manifests differently depending on the subject. I mean, ancient Alexandria, Cleopatra's Alexandria, is a city that's entirely lost to us. There is barely a sign she ever lived there. But if you read the ancient accounts, you have account over and over and over again of the opulence and the beauty and really precise descriptions of Cleopatra's Alexandria. So, it's a different base of evidence, but you can draw, a glorious picture using things differently. So I feel as if it's a different project every time. Even with Franklin, this will be a different approach to him, using a different set of tools. I think the only thing I would say methodologically is a little bit of obsessive-compulsive disorder helps, and that leaving no stone unturned, no newspaper unread, no supporting document, unobserved is really crucial. So that you always think there's going to be that one document that's going to unlock your subject for you, and it's probably a crazy way to live, but it can also yield rewards.
I want you all to know, you saw the video earlier, that if you, I went back and watched an interview that I did with Stacey in 2015, I think. I'd forgotten all of it. And it was fabulous, not because of me, but because of her. And if you want more of what we've done a lot of interviews with her, go to Robert Browning's creation, the C-SPAN archive, and you can find all these interviews there. Because we aren't even touching the surface of everything that she knows. Who has a question? Over here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Lucy Gibbs. I'm a political science major here at Purdue, and I'm a freshman. A big part of my academic work here at Purdue is teamwork. And so you are an author, you have to work in groups of people, and there are a lot of differentiating ideas and opinions. I was wondering how you deal with criticism and how has it gotten easier to receive over the years?
No, terribly. I don't think I know a writer who, there's this pathology which attaches to waiting for your book to come out, where you're reading symbols in the weather. You just don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's you're basically nibbling off the ends of your fingers in anxiety because you have no idea if what you've written is good. You hope it is, but whether it's good or whether it's bad, it doesn't necessarily indicate whether it's going to be well or poorly received. So there's just a feeling of utter nakedness when the book finally, heads out into the world. And then, of course, you think you can begin to exhale when the first good review comes in, and then the second review hits you over the head like a 2x4. So, no, I find it to be I always wonder, why am I doing this? Because I find that to be so difficult. But every other writer I know feels the same way. I don't know anyone, I know people who say they don't read their reviews, but they're lying. Yeah. I don't know anyone who finds it to be an easy part of the job. And I think that you never feel, no matter how much of a veteran you are, I don't think you ever know if what you've written is good. And that sounds kind of insane, but I think it takes you a certain amount of time to come around, if you ever come around. Because, of course, you just want to rewrite the thing.
Tell us more about the Apple TV series and how that kind of thing happens.
So I think about 12 years ago, a producer came to me, maybe 15 years ago, and said, I'd like to make this into a series. I should probably say that my first book was optioned when my now 32-year-old son was in preschool. So I don't really hold out much hope that any of these things is ever going to happen. Anyway, so it had been optioned for many years. The option was extended over and over again. And then kind of slowly over time, different people were attached to it and different actors were attached to it. And it just never really, he kept up, this particular producer kept up the momentum. And then at a certain moment, maybe 5 years ago, a dream team kind of fell into place with a writer, with Apple, with another producer, and with Michael Douglas. And everything just kind of snowballed from there. And that was just a sort of lucky concatenation of circumstances where we had a fabulous director. It was a director who had this vision that in the cast, anyone who had been French in the history would be French on the screen, and only Anglo-Saxon actors play the English and the English and the American parts. So a lot of it's actually in French. Was filmed at Versailles and in basically the exact halls that Franklin walked down at the time, and it's a really sumptuous production. So just visually, it's quite beautiful and historically accurate for the most part.
And how much did you participate in the whole process?
I had a lot to do with the early scripts, and then they pretty much, shunted me aside and forgot I existed, which is fair, which is what you expect. I did go to visit last summer. I went to visit the set. They were shooting at Versailles, and so you had all of these opulently dressed cast members milling about with their fabulous wigs and on their cell phones.
Do you have any expectation, because so little has been written about Samuel Adams, that this could turn into a television or a movie?
Not really. I think partly, I don't know, how much of colonial America have we ever seen? I guess the John Adams series. Not really. I just don't see it.
Kenzie?
Hello again. As has been made very evident tonight, talking about you write about a ton of different types of historical figures. So I'm wondering if there is a certain quality or type of thing in each person that you write about and choose to write about.
You get the 2-question award, first of all. Yes, and I think it's changed since I started. I think for a long time I really thought I would only write literary biography, which is to say biographies that are themselves literary, but are about figures in literature. So my first 2 books were about writers. And then it began to occur to me that most writers spend their lives writing, and that's not inherently narratively interesting. And I think that's why, and I came to Franklin in part the first time because I admired his prose so much. So that felt to me on some level like a literary biography, but of course what he accomplishes in those years in France has nothing to do with literature. It has a lot to do with how eloquent he could be, but nothing really to do with literature. And subsequent to that, and as I have gotten older, I have felt much more urgently that I wanted to write about people who changed the world in some significant way. And I think that's why I keep going back to colonial America. One of my kids says, "Can't you get out of colonial America?" The answer, it seems to be no. And part of that is just that it is fundamental. It is so seminal, I don't want to leave. There's just so much there that remains, it seems to me, to be written about. And for example, with this book, you have someone who utterly changes, on whom there is a pivot from one direction to the other, and where you can really chart that quite definitively, but for whom there was really no story. So that, appealed in a way I think that writing about any of the other 5 subjects I might have thought about at the time didn't quite appeal. So yes, I think that someone who actually changes the picture has become more important to me than someone who left the pages. Yes, I would like to write about Joan Didion, but I think I won't.
Thank you.
By the way, folks that are not students would like to ask questions, you can just go to the microphone over here. We've still got a couple student questions to come, so be our guest. Jack?
Hello again. My name is Jack Barnon. I'm a sophomore here at Purdue, and I am a double major in political science and economics. Now, I really do like history, and my dad has raised me as a history buff, kind of growing up, doing different, tours or family vacations. And he's mentioned a lot of different, political or historical figures, some of which you have written about. But I was curious to know, who is your kind of most, as you see, undervalued or underappreciated historical figure that you've come about maybe in your research or through just about different experiences that you've had in your life?
Unfortunately, I would like to say it's probably Samuel Adams because he's so absent from this picture. Along the way, there will be other figures whom you realize are crucial. Dr. Warren, who's a great associate of Samuel Adams, would be one. There is almost nothing in terms of literature about him. So, there have been people whom I've thought, well, this would be a great subject, but the documentation, to my mind, isn't enough to be able to get a great biography out of it. I'm not sure that there's anyone where I've thought, both the archival material and the importance were going to be able to, sell me on writing a book.
Thank you.
As you know, we were talking earlier, this university has on campus here over 50,000 students, and you went to Williams College in Williams, Massachusetts. Is it Williams, Massachusetts?
Williamstown.
Williamstown. What was the impact on you of your college experience in 2,000 students?
Yeah, it was an exquisitely good education. I think I spent a lot of time in my room reading Nabokov. So a lot of the gift of those years, I think, was the fact that you could, the emphasis obviously was on the liberal arts. I was a philosophy major, as you know, which really is useless. But I like to think came in, handy somewhere along the way. And, small classrooms, seminar style, lots of exegesis of literature, which I like to think has played some role in what came next.
Dean, do you want to defend philosophy? Go ahead.
Chuck Wineland. I work in ag communications here at Purdue. A lifetime ago, I was a political science major, but then I spent 30 years editing newspaper copy. I was intrigued by you talking about what stays and what goes, and you used to be an editor yourself. When you self-edit, are there things that you talk yourself out of doing, words or phrases that you use and then throw away that you keep wanting to come back to?
I am a relentless reviser. So there are always, 737 drafts of everything. I think there are things where I have been so amused by the material, or things where I have spent so much time, I flew halfway across the country to get an interview with someone. No matter what I do, that interview is going in the book. And only, 2 years later did I realize this has nothing to do with the narrative at hand. It's just that I spent, I went into a basement that had fleas to get these documents, so therefore I think I must use them. So I think a lot of it is overcoming your worst instincts about, you put so much time into something, or, I got very obsessive with this book about painting a picture of what the 18th century Harvard mind was like by going through the master's theses that Harvard students wrote in the 1740s when Samuel Adams was at Harvard, because it was like a blueprint of what everyone was thinking. It was brilliantly revealing, and I think I kind of over-larded the egg on that one just because I was so fascinated by the kinds of questions that these people were asking at the time. Because they run the gamut from, did the ends justify the means, to do vegetables breathe? They were great. They were all over the board. So I think there's a certain, inherent sort of booby trap there in terms of the material that you spent too long, you fondled it too much because it was just too funny, and it really doesn't belong in the book, or you've made your point already, you don't need to make it again, or the material for which you just worked overly hard.
When you are not writing, what are you reading?
Almost entirely fiction. I read nonfiction, obviously, to endorse friends' books or to endorse other books of nonfiction. If left to my own devices, I think I would subsist completely on fiction. And I think that's partly just because I really appreciate style on the page, and the most stylish writers among us, for the most part, are writing fiction.
On the back of this book, there is an endorsement by somebody I've never heard of, David McCullough. He says, Schiff writes with such spirit and agility that to read her books is something like watching a great dancer. To say that her latest book is fascinating and insightful is hardly sufficient. It's brilliant from start to finish. That was on The Witches.
I think that's like going to be on my tombstone, don't you think?
But you know, what is the value of I always look at the endorsements, and it matters to me when I don't know a book at all, but what is the value to you as an author who on these endorsements?
Well, I think cynically speaking, remember that galley is going to go to Brian Lamb, but it's also going to go to every reviewer in town. And so, especially in the day and age in which we live, in which there are relatively few review media anymore, your chances of getting reviewed are greater if you have a David McCullough blurb on the back of your book. So it's a way of both placing the book in some sort of context, you know, ultimately for the consumer, but in the immediate, for the person who might book you on, you know, a C-SPAN show, or the person who might assign a review of your book to the LA Times.
Question.
Hi again. Okay, so in your opinion, what role can writers and intellectuals, such as yourself, play in shaping the national discourse and addressing challenges the world faces today?
Wow, I like to think that's huge, but I'm beginning to doubt my word on that one. I mean, you know, books, it's a little bit what we were just saying about news and newspapers. It's getting to be a very difficult climate out there, particularly for a hardcover book. And so to somehow inject the ideas with which most of us are writing into the ecosystem is not particularly easy. So I like to think that, you know, a big best-selling book by Robert Caro or Ron Chernow, or for that matter, a musical based on, for example, a book by Ron Chernow, is going to remind people of the importance of history, or is going to, you know, bring people around to a certain way of thinking. I'm not feeling particularly sunny about that at the moment. I do think that there are some of us, however, who really feel like they want to, you know, explore that kind of resonance, and for whom it clarifies our thinking.
Could you have made a living if this is all you did in your life?
Not at first. The problem with nonfiction is that you have a huge initial outlay, because you do your research before you start writing. And for my, I guess, first 3 books, there was a massive amount of travel. I mean, for the Nabokov book, there were people who'd known the Nabokovs all over Europe. There were people all over America. There was the archive in Switzerland. It was just a huge amount of travel, for which I had a Guggenheim Fellowship. But after that, I mean, after those first couple of books and after a bestseller, it's a little bit easier.
How hard is it to get a Guggenheim Fellowship?
I think pretty hard.
I mean, did you go?
200 or so given a year.
Did you go to them and ask for one?
Yes, you apply for one.
And what do you have to do?
And that was a game changer. 3 applications, 3 letters of reference, and a proposal. And then you just pray very hard.
Joshua.
Hi, Stacy. I'm a philosophy minor, and I'm here to...
Well, look where you're going to end up, honey.
That's not a bad place to be. But I have 2 questions from me, and then 1 question that I got as I was getting up here. Is there any philosopher that you think would make a good subject?
You know, someone's just done a book on Spinoza, which is supposed to be fabulous. And I had often thought that Spinoza has always been very opaque to me, so that is why I have deserted it as an idea. But this new book is supposed to be terrific. I don't think I don't think that I would run kicking and screaming from the idea of a philosopher, but I've never thought of someone, you know, Montaigne, if you consider him a philosopher, would be a great biographical subject, but it's been done beautifully before. And that's the other part of the obstacle course here is Edith Wharton would be a great subject, but she's been done brilliantly by Hermione Lee. You know, Robert Louis Stevenson's a great subject, but he's been done brilliantly by Richard Holmes. So you know, you're also running around the other books that you so admire.
Oh, it's tough.
Tough, very tough, yeah.
Have any of the concepts that you learned during your education in philosophy impacted the way you write your books? I
like to think that there is a discipline in thinking which has come into play. It's hard for me to actually kind of quantify that in any way. Obviously, being able to parse an opaque or a Baroque text is very helpful when it comes to parsing, say, a Puritan sermon, or for that matter, reading some of the accounts of the ancients of the Hellenistic world. So the discipline, I like to think anyway, has paid off, but nothing I can put my immediate finger on.
All right. And then my question from the audience, what fiction book are you reading right now?
I just read a marvelous novel called Martyrs, but what did I just read before that, which was such genius? Oh, Neil Williams' This Is Happiness. It's Niall, he's an Irish writer. It's a brilliant, brilliant, beautiful, sunny novel that will make you feel so much better about the world. And it's gorgeously written.
Will, last question.
And it's a very short question, too. You mentioned earlier in the night that there are these human characteristics that you see through all these characters, or like some sort of human nature. What is that human nature, regardless of culture or the time difference between these characters?
Well, what I mean by that is that, like, when Ben Franklin gives his formula for how you raise money for, say, a library or a hospital, he's essentially codifying precisely the behavior we use today when we try to shame our friends into giving to our favorite charities. And there is nothing, it's precisely the formula with which we ourselves are familiar. When you read antithetical reports about Cleopatra from her enemies, they're not only dealing, as I said, from a playbook that's been handed to them from previous generations, but they apply very much to the way we read the news today, and we see character being blackened by the opposing side. So, you know, those instincts, the tribalism, all kinds of things feel just over and over again feel very familiar. And I think that's part of my attraction to Franklin, is that he's so consistently astute about what you can count on a person doing. I mean, it was Franklin who observed that if you ask someone who doesn't like you for a favor, they'll like you more. That makes no intuitive sense. And it's exactly right. I've tried it. But it's that kind of psychological jujitsu that Franklin was so good at, and that, you know, every bit of that feels very modern today.
Stacy Schiff has always been a terrific interview, and I think we're very fortunate that she would make this trip to Purdue and join us this evening, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.